Very much for coming out to today's event on the Sustainable Development Goals and getting to carbon zero. It seems very timely, seeing as it looks like the announcement is coming tomorrow about what the detail of the government's climate legislation will be. To start off with, I thought I'd just introduce myself and tell you a bit about the Helen Clark Foundation. You might not have heard of us before. We only launched on the 21st of March. So my name is Kathy Errington. I'm the Executive Director of the Helen Clark Foundation. We're a new independent public policy think tank, and we're based here at AUT. Our goal is to promote discussion and issue research on topical issues facing New Zealand. If you'd like to learn more about us or to support our work, please look at our website at helenclark.foundation. We are trying to build up a membership, so we'd love you to become members if you were interested. By being a member, you get first chance to register for events like today, which do fill up very fast. The format of today's event is that I'll be asking our panel some questions for the first half hour or so, and then there'll be an opportunity for the audience to ask questions. My colleague, Paul, who you may have seen at the door, will come round with a microphone when the time comes. This is Paul here. Wait, hi, Paul. The event runs until approximately 11, but you don't need to leave right away. As you can see, there's tea and coffee available, and we'd encourage you to introduce yourselves to other people at your table. Turning to the substance of today's event, we have a panel of 3 distinguished speakers here to discuss how can the Sustainable Development Goals, or the global goals as they're sometimes called, help us take action on climate change. But we've got firstly the Right Honourable Helen Clark, who served as New Zealand Prime Minister from 1999 to 2008, and then became Administrator of the United Nations Development Programme from 2009 until 2017. She continues to be highly engaged in issues from across the sustainable development spectrum, including women's empowerment, health and drug policy, climate action and peace. Dr. David Hall is a senior researcher at the Policy Observatory here at AUT. He has a PhD in politics from the University of Oxford, and his research focuses on the politics of climate change. He has a book coming out in June with Bridget Williams Books, which is called A Careful Revolution, and it looks at these kinds of climate policy issues in a New Zealand context. So I encourage you to look into that if you'd like to read more deeply about the issues raised today. Finally, we have Dr. Jo Spratt, who's the Advocacy and Campaigns Director for Oxfam New Zealand. Her PhD focused on changes to New Zealand's overseas aid policy, with a particular interest in the Pacific. So as you can see, we've got 3 experts here today to tackle what is an increasingly urgent problem. The threat of climate change has been leading the news regularly this year. It seems to have almost never been out of the headlines. For example, the recent Extinction Rebellion protests caused chaos in London. Closer to home, the Environment Aotearoa report released by the Ministry for the Environment in April painted a profoundly bleak picture of where things are at with New Zealand's environment, including shocking facts like 90% of New Zealand's seabirds are threatened with extinction, and that climate change promises to further destabilise our already fragile ecosystems. But throwing our hands up and giving in to despair is in itself a kind of climate change denialism. So today's event is geared at asking, so what can we do? How can we make things better in a practical way? You can see behind me the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. These were a set of 17 goals adopted in 2015, aiming to be a universal agenda to eradicate poverty, foster peace and protect the environment by 2030. So how can they actually help us take action on climate change? Those are the kind of issues we want to address here today. What's the point of them? So I'll just take a seat and I'll start asking our panel some questions. And please have a think about any questions you yourself might want to ask. There will be an opportunity for that at the end of our discussion. So my first question is for Helen Clark, and our audience here has varying levels of familiarity with the Sustainable Development Goals. So could you set the scene for us as to how they came about from the Millennium Development Goals and what was the purpose of making them?
Well, thank you, Kathy. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming to the seminar, and thank you, AUT, for hosting the seminar, and also the Foundation in the Policy Observatory. Second point is, yes, we see that the zero carbon legislation is due to be unveiled any day now. Could be today, could be tomorrow, when there's an event in Taranaki, I understand, where Jacinda will be going and talking about the just transition which is required, because with the decision about no more oil and gas exploration offshore, which affects Taranaki, you need to be thinking, well, what is the regional development story from there? And just transition is very much part of the language around climate change these days. Thirdly, on climate change, not everybody gets it right. I just tweeted last night a report I saw of the speech of the US Secretary of State at the Arctic Council meeting in Finland. And his speech focused on the opportunities for trade which would open up with the shrinkage of the Arctic ice. So I was moved to say, quite staggering to see a speech from a key participant, not named, on the opportunities for trade from the shrinking Arctic ice, and no comment on the ecological catastrophe that it represents. So not everybody gets it. So our carbon zero legislation is obviously, extremely well timed. It does require a whole new way of doing development, because we all want high human development, but we've done it to date at a cost to the planet, and that can't carry on. And that means a sustainable development approach is required, and that's what the goals are about. So if I answer Catherine's question specifically, there's a history at the UN with environment that really goes back to 1972, with the major conference on environment and development in Stockholm, which for the first time acknowledged in UN circles that development had come at a high price. 20 years later, there was the Rio Earth Summit. And some Kiwis who went, like Bob Harvey, who was Mayor of Waitakere Council, came back very inspired by Agenda 2021 and what needed to be done at the local government level. 1992 Rio Earth Summit was also when the three big environmental conventions of the UN were launched, sort of foundation conventions: the Climate Change Convention, the Biodiversity Convention, and the Convention to Combat Desertification. Then we come to year 2000 and the Millennium Declaration at the UN, and I went up there as a young PM to sign the declaration and be at the summit. And there were about 7 points identified in that declaration, which were then turned into the Millennium Development Goals, with an 8th goal, which was about partnerships for development. Now, in a sense, those goals were about what developing countries had to do. And there wasn't much onus on developed countries. And that was always a source of grievance. So the MDGs had a life of through to 2015, but the discussion about what should replace them was beginning about 4 years out. And in 2012, there was a Rio +20 conference. And Rio +20 didn't agree on much, because the UN unfortunately doesn't agree on a lot these days. But one thing it did agree on was that there should be a working party set up at the General Assembly to develop sustainable development goals as the replacement agenda. And it was said from the start that these should be universal. This wasn't an agenda for developing countries. It was a global agenda, and everyone would have commitments under it. So that's the origin of getting through to the SDGs.
Thank you for that scene setting. Some people have criticised the SDGs compared to the Millennium Development Goals as unfocused, because there's 17 goals, but under those goals sit 169 targets. Why did the UN do it this way? I could say, as a former senior official, that this is what happens when you leave it to member states to negotiate an agenda, because everybody wants something, right? And if you look at Goal 16, peaceful and inclusive societies, in effect, the developed countries, the so-called WEOG group, which we're part of, Western European and others, and orphans, as I sometimes say, they were very keen to have a goal in on inclusive governance, representation, responsiveness, anti-corruption, transparency, and so on.
A lot of developing countries didn't like that very much at all, but the price for getting 16 in was to agree to a lot of other things. And then everybody had their stake in the ground. For example, there's a goal on oceans. Well, New Zealand was terribly keen on the oceans goal. If you had left it to the professionals, what would have been recommended is trying to collapse that maybe back down to more like the 7 or 8, which you could do because there's a lot of duplication and overlap, and then to be rather more targeted. The MDGs had about 29 targets. This is 169, and let's not count the indicators because they're about 230 plus and still being developed. And of course, from a government point of view, and I put my old PM hat on here, if you're trying to pursue 17 goals and 169 targets simultaneously, it's quite difficult, isn't it? So you do have to focus as a government. But I think leaving all that aside, the key thing is the approach. And the approach is saying that, yes, we want higher human development. We want people to live with enough income and the full, course of their natural life and have access to universal health coverage and schooling. But we want to be able to achieve this for everybody in a way that doesn't trash the environment. We've got to find that recipe. And it's not rocket science, by the way. It requires leadership and political will. It is doable, which is why, as Catherine said, we shouldn't just sit and think, oh my God, things are terrible. The latest report on the species, for example, which we're driving to extinction, all the forecasts about the impacts of global warming and so on. I mean, they're horrible, and the trends on world poverty and hunger aren't great either. But it is all changeable, but it needs leadership. And that's why I think, we look to our current New Zealand government for leadership on a lot of these issues, and there are other governments that are determined to lead, but many more have got to step up.
Thank you. So to Jo, from a ground level perspective, working for an organisation like Oxfam, how can big high-level agreements like the SDGs engage ordinary people for specific policy changes? So, for example, what we're focusing on today is taking action on climate change. But I guess from your perspective, what's the point of something like the SDGs?
Yeah, I guess my short and blunt answer, and potentially provocative, is that we can't use abstract high-level agreements like the SDGs to motivate the citizen action we need to to address the climate challenges we face. So I've got a more nuanced argument underneath that, so I'll just take a couple of moments to explain that. So first up, I think the SDGs are a really important articulation of our shared goals for humanity and the planet, and they provide us with a crucial guide for what we want to achieve and to monitor progress to get there. And I think they're particularly important for policymakers, academics, decision makers, people potentially like many of us in the room. The issues that they embody are the challenges that face humanity are big and complex, and many of them are collective action issues. And climate change, none more so, really. So this means, because they're big and complex, they can be quite hard to explain. They can be quite hard for people to understand, and it can be difficult for people to really get a sense of what they can do as individuals to have an influence on such a big and complex issue. And climate change is a collective action issue, so we need every individual to be taking action and to be demanding more action from our corporations and our governments to really address climate change in the time that we have. So to achieve this mass collective action, we need to communicate in particular ways, and not just to impart information and hope that people will act, but to really tell people stories and messages that compel them to act, that get them to do things, and sometimes, and probably increasingly, things that are hard to do. And so to communicate for action, we need to make these issues concrete and tangible and real, and we need to give people a sense of agency that they can actually do something to have an impact. And we need to tap into the values that we all hold that support collective action, and we need to engage with people emotionally at an individual level, because it's only when we have a sense of emotion that we have a deep concern that we will be compelled to act. So the SDGs are abstract, and they're linked to another abstract concept, which is the United Nations. And people walking up and down Queen Street or stocking the shelves in the supermarket don't really think about the SDGs or the United Nations as much as we'd like them to. People are thinking more about climate, but not, again, as much as we need them to take that, to have that sense of ownership and engagement and to compel them to act. And some recent polling from UMR shows that more and more people are beginning to think that our government is doing enough to address climate change, and this worries me. Because we all know that to stay below 1.5 degrees, we need to do much, much more. Our governments need to do much, much more, our corporations and all of us. So to achieve this mass citizen collective action, to repeat the point really, we really need to be communicating with people in ways that are concrete, that are real, that give them a sense of agency, that show them that they can do things, that connect with them emotionally and that compel them to act. And I don't think we can spend time trying to explain the SDGs as well as telling those stories. So my more nuanced answer is that I think we can talk about the SDGs by talking about the issues embodied in the SDGs, but not specifically talking about the SDGs, and then we'll get the citizen action that we need to achieve the SDGs.
David, did you have any comment on that?
Kia ora tātou. I'd just add, yeah, I mean, I completely agree with what Joe said. The UN SDGs aren't sufficient, but they are an incredible communications tool. I think they are a triumph of branding. And that sounds a little bit trite, but I don't mean it like that at all. They are incredibly effective, instantly recognizable visual tools that help to coordinate thinking and to convey that an organisation is taking these issues seriously and building that into their decision making to some extent. We can always press on the detail of that decision making and that institutional integration of these, but they are a great branding tool and a way of coordinating thinking across different organisations. And I think while they have been quite an obscure tool, quite a technocratic tool until recently, I think that the momentum is picking up and you are seeing a lot more organisations starting to employ these, including our own at AUT. They've been a vital instrument for building the strategy for our sustainability roadmap here. And so I think there is an effective function for them at that communicative level.
Yeah, I mean, that they are a brand, as David says. And actually, if you go back to the design phase, this was an agenda which had immensely more civil society input into it than any other UN agenda had ever had. Most of them tend just to be negotiated at New York by diplomats and, with the civil society groups with their nose pressed to the window and, trying to be heard. But there was quite an open process around these, which raised awareness in many countries about the process, and then the groups got very involved with the negotiators back particularly in 2014 as well. So I wouldn't sort of rule out communicating the SDGs as a framework, but then I do agree you've got to tell stories about what's got to be done, because you've got to go from the abstract then to the specific. What does it mean? And here's what it means. That's the story.
So I guess focusing on a specific issue, David, specifically regarding New Zealand taking action on climate change, what are the major challenges that you see in the way, and what initiatives do you see that are making progress?
Yeah, well, globally and domestically, the challenge is politics today. We really do have all of the science that we need to make significant inroads. That we can always have more science, but we do have sufficient science. I think actually we have sufficient technical knowledge as well to at least make major inroads into solving some of these issues. There are technological solutions that lie ahead, and we should work towards them, but then part of that is politics as well. It's also about where we deploy our research funding. It's about mission-oriented investment, making a decision to actually channel financial flows towards solving some of these problems. The technological solutions don't just appear out of nowhere. They need political commitment behind them as well. So it really is the politics, I think, which is the great challenge. And the politics are very hard because it's essentially a choice between two forms of disruption, a very long-term disruption which is starting to take hold now and starting to manifest its effects, which is an existential disruption. But there is a short-term disruption as well, the disruption of undertaking the low emissions transition, the disruption of people being displaced from jobs that are high carbon jobs, the disruption of having to change our land management practices and change some of the ways of life that we're familiar with. And these can feel existential for people as well, and we shouldn't dismiss people's agonies and sense of anxiety around some of those political changes and lifestyle changes which are ahead. But obviously we need to keep them in perspective as well. That long-term disruption is, as I said, it's existential for us as a species. So the politics is the great challenge, and there are a lot of institutional political solutions emerging. My understanding actually is that the zero carbon bill has been announced at 11 a.m. today. So yeah, so that will come out. The UN SDGs is something at the international level, and it's worth noting that by and large, as far as climate mitigation goes, the UN SDG framework kicks the mitigation issue mostly into the Paris Agreement. The focus of the UN SDGs is much more on the adaptation side, which I think is really valuable and important because that is often the neglected part of the mitigation adaptation equation. And in New Zealand as well, there's been recent reforms around the ETS, the emissions trading scheme as well, to make that more effective. But I would just finish by emphasising that all of these are institutional, architectural interventions and actions. They set up the framework for decision making and understanding the problem and channeling some of this political decision making, but they're not in and of themselves the change that we actually need. They set up the mode for effective decision making, but the actual change needs to happen much more at the project level, and certainly domestically I hope that once the zero carbon bill is pushed through in form of legislation, that we really shift our emphasis to the project level, to the actual projects and activities that make those mitigation and adaptation impacts. And the zero carbon bill, the climate commission that it is likely to create will help us to make those decisions in an informed and legitimate way, and that is absolutely vital, but that emphasis needs to shift to the project level.
Jo, did you have any comment on that?
No, I don't think so. I mean, in terms of challenges, I guess, to emphasise the collective action challenge again, I mean, politics, when we have such vested interests working against climate change action, politics is the people, politics is power, power is the people. So we really need to get the people on board. I think the other big challenge is this question of just transitions, and we have this big conference in the next couple of days, which I think is really important, and hopefully we'll start to look at some of the issues, because really we need to make sure that we transition in a way that protects the people who experience the daily indignity of poverty and inequality, and it is the wealthiest who probably need to make the biggest behaviour changes. So how do we manage to get that balance right?
So the next question we actually drew from social media. We've got a lot of people in the audience today from local government. Firstly to Helen, and then I'll invite comments from the other two on the panel, how can the SDGs help governments to make better policy, and specifically local governments, if you could comment on what they can do?
Well, if we take the SDGs as a framework, it's saying look at policy holistically. And that requires whole of government coordination, whatever level of government you're talking about. Actually, one of my interests is as patron of the Commonwealth Local Government Forum, which has a membership across the Commonwealth, a conference every 2 years with mayors and local government associations and senior officials. And this Commonwealth Local Government organisation picked up the MDGs and ran with them, and it's picked up the SDGs and is running with them. And the conferences are very much oriented to supporting local governments to know about the framework and then be thinking about how to apply it locally. And in many ways, I think local government is better placed than central government for something like the SDGs. Why do I say that? It's because local governments still plan. They're required by law to plan. They're required by law to have participatory planning. In developed countries, countries long ago gave up the National Development Plan. That was seen as old hat. So in a sense, for us to, at a national level in any developed country, to be pursuing the SDGs, we have to kind of retrofit what we're doing for planning, because it does require a very deliberate approach to coordinate across all policy areas to get sustainable development results. So I actually have a view that local government could lead the way on this, because it still has a very developed planning mechanism. If I could just come back to a couple of points that David raised, which I very much agree with. Look, climate action, it's all about politics. Late last year, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change did its big update report. And they said late last year there's 12 years left to make the changes required to stop global warming exceeding the 1.5 degree target of Paris. I went to a presentation by senior IPCC people in Vietnam last year at a climate change conference, and they said, you know, all our work shows that in economic terms, in technical and technological terms, and geophysical terms, it's possible to turn the tide in what was then 12 years is now 11 and a half. So then you say to yourself, well, why is it proving so damn difficult? It's politics, right? Because it does require some difficult decisions. And let's not think that getting to zero carbon in New Zealand doesn't involve difficult decisions. It does. It involves decisions about our agriculture, which is very intensive and contributing half of our greenhouse gases. So that's an issue to deal with. But how about the issue of our energy? In a good rain year, we're 80 to 82% renewable. But every year, I understand, we're drawing about 17% of our electricity from the Huntly coal-fired and gas-fired power station, right? That's got to go. The world has to get out of coal. It must be out of coal by 2050, but for developed countries, really, we need to be thinking 2030. And one of the targets that will need to be set on zero carbon is getting New Zealand out of coal. So then you've got to think, well, what's going to fill in the gap? Because New Zealand, with its renewables, has what we call a lot of intermittent renewables, right? The hydro lakes aren't always full. The sun isn't always shining. The wind isn't always blowing. So what will fill the gap? Now, obviously, we have some geothermal, but the first paper that was produced by Kathy for the Helen Clark Foundation was on the potential of green hydrogen. And that actually does have the potential to fill the gap for us if we can grow and scale up the industry. And we can make green hydrogen because we've got the renewable energy to produce it. But there's going to have to be decisions like that. I think that, really, and coming back to some of the points Joe's been making, governments can lead, but isn't it fantastic when the citizens also get the point? But the citizens need to be empowered and have agency and have the knowledge to know what they too can do, and also to keep pressure on governments to be keeping with the program. But it's a bit lonely out front if no one's agreeing to come behind. Just on the utterly petty level, I recall when in 2006, I think it was, I announced that New Zealand would aim to be carbon neutral, zero carbon neutral, by 2030, and we then started quite a range of measures to achieve that. What was focused on politically? The petty things. She's telling you what light bulb you can't use. Well, too right? The rest of the world was moving to the energy efficient light bulb. What was wrong with us? She's telling you what temperature you can have your shower at. Well, actually, you do have the power to control the temperature of your water cylinders, and that's important also for energy efficiency. So it's all politics, and it can be very petty, and that's why empowering people having the agency to know what needs to be done and to lead themselves on the way they organise themselves is extremely important.
So, David, you've done work on what's called climate finance. Could you explain to our audience what that is?
Yeah, sure. I did a report for the Ministry for the Environment, co-authored that, called Climate Finance Landscape for Aotearoa, New Zealand. So we published that here last year. And that was just to give an overview of what climate finance is and what its relevance is for New Zealand. And climate finance simply is financial flows that are directed towards tangible mitigation, adaptation, impacts and outcomes, projects and activities. And it can be any kind of financial flow. It can be debt from smallest sort of micro loans through microfinance mechanisms all the way up to large sovereign green bonds that some nations around the world are beginning to issue. It can also include equity, so shares in companies which deliver climate-aligned outcomes. And it can just be grants and donations and public investments into climate-aligned infrastructure. So I said earlier that adaptation is the neglected partner in the Paris Agreement, but climate finance is really the completely forgotten third pillar of the Paris Agreement. It is a pledge by all nations to contribute to mitigation, adaptation, and climate finance, defined as making finance flows consistent with a pathway towards low greenhouse gas emissions and climate resilient development. So it's often forgotten, but that is an obligation which we will have to undertake and report on in time. And it also hangs in behind all of the SDGs as well. If you go looking through the indicators, a lot of them for all of these different goals talk about mobilising financial flows to delivering the outcomes that these large goals encompass. And the challenge here, I mean, what interests me with climate finance is it's really where the rubber hits the road. Someone's going to have to hand over cash, and at the moment there's not enough money being handed over, not by a long shot. An analysis was done of what would take to deliver the UN SDGs by developing countries. It was estimated that 3.9 trillion US in investment would be required annually, but the world is investing 1.4 trillion annually, which leaves a shortfall of 2.5 trillion annually. So a substantial shortfall that's known as the financing gap. Governments can't cover that gap in and of themselves, and so there's an acknowledgement that private finance is going to be required, but the question is how to pull that private finance out of some of the places that it is being used at the moment and put it into active investments. A lot of it's been pulled up in the housing market at the moment, where it's more or less static and not contributing to some of those issues. A lot of it's ending up in tax havens and so on and so forth. And these are all challenges which are part of delivering the UN SDGs, and another reason that a lot of these political and ethical issues are inextricable from developing, from delivering sustainable development. I'll leave it there.
Did you have any comments to that?
Yeah, well, you know, maybe morphing into the international scene for climate finance, and really I think the principles are very much like those set out in another of the big 2015 agendas, which was the Addis Ababa Action Agenda on Financing for Development. And it, for the first time, stopped pretending that north-south aid flows were the answer to development finance, and said you have to draw on all sources, domestic and international, public and private, and developmental and environmental. So if you go through that on climate finance, you have two key public funds. One, the Global Environment Facility has been financing for years in this area, but also out of earlier agreements came the Green Climate Fund. it's quite grossly undercapitalised, but it does have the capacity to give quite big grants. For example, Tuvalu, in partnership with UNDP, a couple of years, 3 years ago probably, got one of the early grants, and that was in the high 30 millions for adaptation. Obviously, Tuvalu is particularly challenged with sea level rise, so the grants can be quite large. Secondly, there's quite a lot of climate finance going up bilaterally from individual donor countries to recipients. Then you've got the role of the international financial institutions like the World Bank, like actually the IMF, which needs to give fiscal space when countries are very challenged by major disasters and may have to exceed, well, what would have previously been considered a prudent debt level. The Asian Development Bank, all those regional banks. I've just been at the ADB conference in Fiji. I mean, you know, the good news is the ADB has not lent on coal since 2013, right? That is good news. The World Bank changed its policy about the same time. So their lending is geared to sustainable energy. Now, on the issue of climate justice, developing countries will not accept that it is fair for them to be asked to fund all their own adaptation. They say we never caused this problem. And actually, most of them never caused or contributed to the problem. So that's why the public funds are important for the poorest, the smallest, the most vulnerable. But it is doable if you break it down like that.
Joe, I was wondering if you could comment in terms of supporting less developed countries. What do you think New Zealand could do to better support climate change, adaptation and mitigation in the Pacific? Because I know that's an area of your expertise.
Thanks, Kathy. Yeah, I think actually in many ways this government's really got us back on the right track in terms of helping our friends across the Pacific and elsewhere to adapt and mitigate climate change. Staffing at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs has increased significantly. Our Prime Minister announced a $300 million package over 4 years last year. We have a brand new climate change program within the aid program that is far more and increasingly focused on adaptation, which is absolutely crucial. And looking at things like water, ecosystems, and helping governments and communities to access climate finance, because some of these climate finance mechanisms are really, really difficult. And also helping them to achieve their NDCs. And then also what we're doing domestically is going to help as well. So the zero carbon bill, finally, we're hopefully about to see it enter through the process. Yeah. That's fantastic. And globally, we've really been talking a lot. All our ministers and our Prime Minister at global events has been talking a lot about our Pacific friends and the challenges they face in the context of climate change. We're a high ambition country. We're a member of the Carbon Neutral Coalition, which I just think I love. We're championing thank you, fossil fuel subsidy reform at the World Trade Organization, which feels like a real David and Goliath battle. And we've also just taken up the co-lead with China on nature-based solutions, which is a key theme at the upcoming UN Secretary-General's Climate Summit. So those things will help in the Pacific. But we can and need to do better. And I think working to mobilise corporate finance is very important and get corporates in the Pacific to focus on building resilient development is crucial. But also with our aid program. So at the moment, really what we need to see every year is a rising aid budget, because aid does help, and this public finance is really important, as Helen said, for a justice issue. But we haven't met our commitments to increasing ODA to 0.7% of GNP. We lag behind, and we haven't met our climate finance. We're not really paying our fair share there either. So really what we need to see every year is a rising aid budget, and within that rising funding towards climate finance. And just as an example, what Oxfam has predicted, the Global Climate Fund that Helen mentioned, that developing countries access to use to take action, is a replenishment round is coming up. And we've calculated New Zealand's fair share over the next 4 years to be 147 million. What we currently give is 3 million. So there's quite a gap there. And when we look at the 300 million that our Prime Minister announced last year, it's 75 million a year for the next 4 years. It's only 25 million more than what the previous government committed. We need to be doing much better.
And on the international level, I mean, that Green Climate Fund was supposed to have $100 million in it by 2020. It's got somewhere around $10 billion, but probably less because President Trump is refusing to hand over the money that his predecessor committed. So that's all of these sort of lack of ambitions from all the countries around the world add up to a major shortfall.
As of late last year, I think they'd actually collected in the banks about $7.5 billion.
Yeah. Right. And I'd just add as well 2 domestic instruments as well, just worth mentioning. There's a $100 million green investment fund that the government set up to be called the Green Investment Finance, but that will be, that's currently in process at the moment, so that's a domestic version of this. And I think it's worth mentioning as well, the Provincial Growth Fund essentially is a regional development fund that is committed to funding these sorts of adaptation activities. It's not often described as that, but climate change is one of its investment criteria, and I think I'd like to see more being made of that. The Provincial Growth Fund is actually an adaptation and sustainable development fund for New Zealand.
So we're just running close to the end of our time today, but I think what I'd like just to close with from our panellists before we go to audience questions is just, can you give us some hope? Because this work can seem incredibly depressing. So what are some stories from around the world, I guess, that have struck you and made an impression on you that are encouraging in terms of making progress on climate action? And we'll start with Helen and go across.
Well, I find the most inspiring stories are always the ones from the community level up, and one of the things UNDP has long done is administer the Global Environment Facility Small Grants Program. And we are talking small grants, right? 30,000 is a big grant under small grants, but you'd be amazed with small amounts of money what communities can do themselves on climate action and adaptation, protecting their seashore, whatever. I've seen a lot of that. Just on the totally micro, you go to a country in the Sahel, which is chronically dry all the time, and sometimes with severe drought, and there's lack of modern energy, right? You don't have an electricity grid, so going to the very local solutions is important. And when I was there about 2.5 years ago in Burkina Faso, I came across a project in a village where the animal dung was collected to go into the biodigester, and that produced the gas for cooking. And that meant the women weren't having to walk miles and miles and miles to the diminishing stock of trees to, cut down wood to bring back for the fire. So look, just at the most local level, you see amazing things. But what we need is both levels. We need governments committed, getting the legislation and the action in place that applies to local government as well, just thinking sustainably.
Yeah, I mean, my inspiration comes from the same place really as the people I've met in villages across different countries in the Pacific who are really just chugging away every day, adapting, thinking about ways to deal with the crops that rot in the ground because there's too much rain, or the crops that wither on the vine because there's not enough rain, not being able to gather the fish from the sea that they are used to be able to sustain themselves. So it's those really small level community actions, the women who get up the morning after the cyclone and get out there to their crops and just start over again. And we also see that here in New Zealand, so I really find hope in that local action. But I agree, we need the ambition and the action from the structural level to support people in those actions. Yeah.
I'm really excited about the idea of natural climate solutions, which is essentially ecological restoration as a way of delivering climate and adaptation outcomes. It can mean any kind of restoration, whether it's wetlands or estuarine environments, but especially forest restoration, which I've been working on, which is partly my interest, but it's been estimated that maybe about a third of our mitigation requirements could be delivered through ecosystem restoration, and obviously that solves a lot of these or not solves, but helps to reverse some of these biodiversity declines that we're that were identified in the report released yesterday. And that's these are the sorts of activities that anybody can get involved in, whether it's a corporate offsetting some of the emissions or volunteering. I was involved in setting up a tree planting movement with the Tyndall Foundation called Trees That Count, and in 2 years it's registered about 24 million trees, native trees planted around the country. So, and then there's lots of ways to participate in that and all sorts of other restoration activities. So I think that's something that really gets me excited, and there's a lot more international recognition around that emerging in the last couple of weeks. So.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So it's nice to have some encouragement to, I guess, kick off our audience questions. So my colleague Paul will come to you with a microphone. Does anyone have a question for the panel? Yeah, oh cool. We've got a few hands. Okay, we'll start.
Move over here.
We'll start up the front here, Paul. Up here. Sorry. Just wait a second till the mic gets to you.
The table behind's very active too.
Yes, yeah, we'll get to them next.
Okay, Jake, I'm from Utah ZB. Just letting you guys all know, the government actually announced the bill about 20 minutes ago. Yeah. But Helen, one thing I'm actually really interested in, and I might ask you later more if you're allowed, because I don't want to hog everyone's time, but you talked a lot about local government taking the charge on this. I guess what's challenges there in the government, the local governments that kind of haven't come on board with it recently, you know, that haven't signed the declaration?
Yeah. Yes, Local Government New Zealand developed a declaration on climate change, and most of the local authorities across the country signed it. But if you search the media, you'll see that the West Coast Council says it's not convinced about climate change. And the Hauraki, Thames Coromandel Council refused to sign, and yet the vulnerability of Thames Coromandel to climate change is quite extraordinary, and they have been consenting for development in areas that are just waiting for the next mega rainfall to flood them, right? So that isn't really terribly sensible. So what I say to local government New Zealand is keep leading. We really look to big and empowered councils like the Auckland one to lead the way. But a lot of councils get it, and they are doing things and really need to be encouraged.
So we had a bunch of questions at that table there. So.
Okay, hello. My name is Mickey. I'm an international student from the United States, actually working with Kathy on a project for the foundation. This is for you, Helen Clark, and excuse me, this might be a little depressing, but hopefully you guys can give us some hope. So just hearing your talk, hearing everyone speak, 11.5 years is going to be here before we know it. And we're not making the progress we need on this issue. We see reports, day in and day out of just, depressing stats, extinction, we keep breaking the just getting a lot warmer and globally. So I guess my question is, do you think, is this a fight we're going to win, given the progress we've been making, the slow progress we've been making already? Do you think this is something we're going to really achieve realistically? Yeah.
Well, as I said, it can be done, but it's going to need a lot more political will. One of the mechanisms under the Paris Agreement is these nationally determined contributions to climate action. And at this time, they're not ambitious enough. At the climate change conference in the coal region of Poland last year, for the Climate Change Convention, Antonio Guterres said that we actually are about 80% short on the level of commitment to stay below the 1.5 degree target. So there needs to be much more ambition in this next sort of round of development of the nationally determined contributions. And again, the Secretary-General has a climate summit coming up in September, which is seen as a rallying cry for governments to step up. And he said that the leaders should come leaving their speeches behind and coming with a plan. So I think there is a kind of push on to up the ambition. Because on the current track, we're heading for a global warming scenario of, if you're optimistic, 2.7, and if you're pessimistic, 3.7 and probably upwards, which is, of course, is extremely bad news for everyone, and particularly for the most exposed countries. So, look, it does call for citizen action, pushing governments. It does call for governments actually to lead, which is their job at every level. From community board through mayors and regional council chairs, leaders at national level and so on. But it is doable. But I think there's now so much news about the scale of the challenge that also gives me a bit of hope. When I think back to when I was leading in this country, it was still more an academic issue, right? People weren't feeling it as much. That was before Hurricane Sandy. It was before the Taiyan typhoon that hit the Philippines, and all the time now you're seeing the news about biggest ever cyclone. It gets worse. So I think there's a lot more awareness, and with awareness then comes the potential to convince people to act.
David and Joe, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would say it's always hard to know what language to use when describing this. And you said, is this a fight we can win? Which I think already sets it up in a way that you can't really, the answer to that question is a bit impossible, because it isn't really a fight to be won per se. It's about, partly because a lot of change is already hard baked into the future, and so managing and adapting to that change is an inevitable part of it. That can't be erased, but we can certainly stop some of the worst aspects of things. And part of it is coming to think of the problem in the right way. It is really accepting change as a way of avoiding the worst possible change, and also accepting that we're not a part of nature, and we're not trying to sort of go to war with climate change per se. We're needing to accept, that we are integrated with nature in an inextricable way, and we change nature and we transform nature by the way that we act, and nature transforms us by the way that it responds, and we're constantly in this dynamic. And accepting that and thinking of it in those terms can start to help as well, I think, to accept the change which is happening, and then also to think realistically about the nature of the challenge that faces us.
Okay, so we've got time for about one more question. Sorry, we've run down the clock a bit. Got one back there.
Hi, I'm Lucy. I'm a politics student from Auckland University. Just on seeing the latest updates on the climate change bill in Parliament today, there's been an extremely soft approach when it comes to agriculture-based emissions like methane. Do you think it's possible for New Zealand to meet their climate change obligations if we do not take a harder stance on the agriculture sector? And if so, how is it going to be possible when agriculture has such a massive influence on New Zealand politics? It's kind of a question for all three of you.
David's done a lot of work on that, so I'll put him in it to start with.
So I haven't seen the zero carbon legislation, so I'm at somewhat of a disadvantage, because for me to be reading Twitter at this moment would be a little bit rude. But I presume what's happened is that a two baskets approach has been taken, and they're treating the greenhouse gases with some sort of distinction. To some extent, I'd need to see the detail to give a fair answer to this, but I think if we take the IPCC special report on 1.5 degrees as our goal that we should be aiming for over the next 12 years, and I think that's right, then that does identify different ideal pathways for the different gases. It calls for a 45% reduction in carbon dioxide by 2030. And more like a 30% reduction in methane by 2030, something in that vein, as I recall. And so as long as whatever infrastructure or whatever architecture they've put in place sets us domestic targets which are consistent with that, then I guess. But as I say, I'm sorry, it's just hard to answer that question fairly without seeing the detail of the legislation.
I think on the politics, I mean, I think farmers care about the world they live in just as much as the rest of us, and they want to protect their environment and they want to keep on engaging in meaningful work. So I just think it's about starting to have more conversations with farmers and trying to understand the values that underpin their reactions, and having these conversations with them about the complex causal issues and trying to bring them on board to support the action we need to stay below 1.5 degrees. So, yeah, I think, and that's not easy, but yeah.
Yeah, I think we need champions for sustainable agriculture because the way our agriculture is developed, A, isn't sustainable, but B, will start to get greater pushback offshore from markets. You know, I'm in Europe quite a lot. There's quite a pushback now on importing from far away because of the carbon footprint of transport. And while, you know, sea transport is obviously less than air, it's still a carbon footprint. But then the conversation quickly turns to, well, you know, how is the product actually produced? What's the greenhouse gas footprint of that? There's quite a strong vegan movement now in the Northern Hemisphere. And I think it all, to me, points to New Zealand going for farming which is of much higher value and far less ecological footprint than it has at the moment. It really needs a whole rethink around sustainability, and that of course leads you to rethink away from commodity to, you know, maybe you produce less but it's actually of greater value because of what it represents. So there's some quite big issues in there which go beyond even the narrowness of the climate conversation into some of the other issues.
Thank you all very much for your time and thank you so much for coming out today. We're a new organisation, the Helen Clark Foundation. We launched on the 21st of March. So it's so great to get your support and to meet you all. We'll be launching a new report on Monday next week, so please keep an eye on Q&A and keep an eye out for that report. It'll be on social media regulation, so you heard it here first. Please become a member if you can. You can do that on our website and just stay in touch and come along to our future events. So thank you all very much and I hope to see you again.